Greetings and salutations. Welcome to what will hopefully be the first of many creepy stories by Candlelight. I am your dastardly dashing storyteller, and I have scoured the earth between the dimensions and even the digital landscape for tales of the unusual, the strange, and the terrifying. So, grab yourself a snack, perhaps even a tasty beverage, and let me tell you a story. I found a door that should not exist by BufferCat. I was a carpenter by trade until I discovered gambling. It started out like any addiction does, a few bets here and there, the wins justifying the losses, before that inevitable turning point where it becomes a compulsion, that crucial moment where everything starts to fall apart. For me, it was my wife and daughter leaving that really brought the situation to a head. I had eaten through our finances to the point they had to move in with her sister. I will never forget little Mia's tears as they drove away, her tiny hand pressed mournfully to the window, too young to understand how badly her father had fucked up. I think that was my lowest point, rock bottom as they like to say in recovery. I found a support group of people like myself and started going to meetings regularly. I collected the tokens of my newfound sobriety as milestones towards repairing my family, sending them to my wife in good faith to show her how hard I was working to gain back their trust. One of the group members was a construction developer and approached me while I was tidying up the coffee station after our Tuesday night meeting. Bob had been one of the original founders of the group and had mentored many men like me when they were just starting out. I had assumed he was going to ask me to do something like that, but he had a different problem and needed my help. His company had bought an old 1845 Greek Revival style estate and was going to renovate and restore it and turn it into a bed and breakfast. The house was prime real estate as far as locations go, with an orchid and a greenhouse on the property. A lush river ran through a plentiful forest in the background so I could see the big picture. Kind of like a nature retreat, so to speak, with the advantage of growing most of the food there on site and having a seasonal orchid to pick from. His problem was no hired help would stay on for more than a few days. I could see the frustration in his expression, and so I asked the obvious question. Why? Bob said, to put it bluntly, that men insisted there was something wrong with the house. One crew claimed that a worker disappeared in the house, but no one could prove it. For a moment, I thought he was pulling my leg. A haunted house? Seriously? Bob wasn't laughing though. In fact, he seemed quite the opposite, like his nerves were frayed from all the stress. They had sunk a considerable amount of money in the project, and if they couldn't show progress soon, his investors were threatening to pull out, which would be a devastating blow to his company. The amount of money he offered me was too good to turn down, creepy house or not. Gainful employment and financial stability might make the perfect trifecta to getting my family back under one roof. So, we sealed it with a handshake. I would start the very next day. First impressions aren't reserved exclusively to people, and as I drove up the long rutted driveway, I felt like the house was scrutinizing me. The large pan windows were narrowed eyes, the crumbling columns on the front porch barred as secular teeth. Even the grass seemed to whisper as the wind pressed between thin bladed lips. I put the truck in park and cut the engine, but left the keys in the ignition, unsure if I was going to get out or run away, kicking up dust in the rear view. I could understand why the other guys didn't stick around, and I hadn't even gone inside yet. Closing my eyes, I pictured Mia in her unicorn pajamas, reading her a bedtime story, my wife laying next to me as I turned out the bedside light. Firming my resolve, I grabbed the car keys in a clenched fist and opened the car door. This house was going to have to deal with me, whether it liked it or not. Bob had said most of the tools were in the respective rooms for each repair. I had bought my own, just in case the other workers helped themselves. Tools, especially on big jobs like this, are worth a lot of money, and it wouldn't be my first rodeo where they suddenly went missing, if you know what I mean. The porch groaned under my steel-toed boots, and I saw planks swelling from both age and excessive moisture, some patches given to termites and dry rotted through. Testing my weight carefully on each step, I finally made it to the double oak doors. They were a sharp contrast to the rest of the hulking mansion-sized house, looking for all the world like they were brand new. Even the brass knocker gleamed as if it had just been polished. Maybe the other guys had already put them in, I reasoned, even though that felt unlikely. As I reached for the doorknob, a gust of wind blew past me, and the onerous door swung wide open with a deep sigh that made my skin tingle. The foyer was shades of shadowy light, wavering like wisps of smoke. Stepping over the threshold, my ears popped forcefully, like I had just reached altitude in a plane. Wiggling my ear in the canal, I tugged on my earlobe to try and realign my equilibrium. Shaking my head, I strode deeper into the house, taking note of the moth-eaten curtains when the door slammed shut, making me jump in surprise. Clutching my chest, my heart thumped against my ribcage. I had no doubts anymore why the other guys abandoned ship. But I didn't have that luxury of cherry-picking jobs. I hadn't had much reliable work. I needed this to work out. So I picked the living room to start in and got down to it. Pulling the musty curtains down was my first priority. That way, I could have more natural light to see by. The electrical was iffy. Bob had said it needed modernizing, so he suggested bringing lanterns as a backup if I worked after sundown. Honestly, I had no intention of being there that late, but with the deadline for the results looming on the horizon, it was probably going to be a necessary evil. Once all the curtains had been lumped in large black trash bags and dumped in the portable dumpster out front, I decided that stripping the tacky floral wallpaper and seeing the condition of the drywall behind it would be the next task. That way, if any of it was too rotten to salvage, I could start with those walls, then spackle the rest and give it ample time to dry before sanding and painting. Even with my mask on, the dust seemed to creep down my throat, making it feel dry and itchy. I had opted for safety goggles and was glad I did. If the dust were this pervasive with a HEPA filter mask, I could only imagine how bad it would sting my eyes. Dust motes and drywall fibers danced in the air on invisible currents, making the sunlight coming through the grimy windows hazy and disordered. Mentally, I reminded myself to tell Bob I needed some industrial fans to help expedite the drying process. Pulling the wallpaper down in strips was time-consuming, not to mention mind-numbingly repetitive, but it had to be done. I was on the last section, noticing it was particularly difficult to gain any traction, almost like it had been glued recently. With a giant tug, it gave way with a loud shh as the glue released its suction grip, and I stumbled backwards, almost losing my balance. But what I found lurking behind it was just as strange. The door was pristine cherry wood, the lacquer finish making the defined wood grain shine beautifully. There was a simple skeleton key lock, but no door handle, which would explain why it was so easily concealed behind the wallpaper. Pulling off my safety gloves, I ran my fingers over it, then held it up to the light. No dust, no glue. It was an expensive wood to use to simply hide behind wallpaper. I don't know about you, but it was painstakingly obvious to me someone went through a lot of trouble to conceal it. Not once, but twice. Bob's words came back to me, unbidden and flashed like lightning in my mind's eye, specifically about how his help got spooked and refused to come back. Creeping closer to the door, I took a knee so my eye could be more level with the keyhole. Without any visible hinges on my side, I would need to open it to remove it without damaging the costly wood. I pressed my right eye to the keyhole and felt a draft tickle my eyelashes. Jerking my head back, I stood up, more confused than ever. Was there a room back there? If there was, it was definitely not in the blueprints. I debated just leaving it be. Bob was paying me well, but unusual mysteries were above my pay grade as far as I was concerned. Yet, I couldn't really do my job if that damn door was there. Stalking to my toolbox, I was cursing that door up and down for the time it was delaying me. I grabbed my lockpicks and was ready to give that door a lesson. Channeling my anger was a lot easier than admitting the door unsettled me. It was more than that. I was afraid of what I might find on the other side. I had seen enough movies to know hidden doors never had happy endings. Stealing my nerves, I kneeled in front of the door and leaned towards the keyhole to see which pick would be the most effective. Skeleton key locks were tricky, some downright frustrating. Fitting my eye almost flush to the lock, I examined the mechanism as best as I could and was just about to pull away when movement made me freeze in place. It was then I realized something I had missed. Something obvious when I really thought about it. The lock should have been impossible to see, but the other side of the door had a light source, despite it being faint. As the cogs in my head spun with this revelation, my face still flushed with the keyhole, I almost screamed when an eye, impossibly wide and predatory, leaned down and stared back at me. Stumbling backwards, I landed on my ass with a oomph as the impact jarred my tailbone up my cervical spine. What in the hell was going on here? Did one of the workers get trapped behind the door? Why would they seal him in? The questions came one after the other, a cacophony of intrusive thoughts that all demanded to be answered. My head swelled with pressure as my heart slammed relentlessly against my ribs. Squeezing my eyes shut, I counted down from 100. After a few tense minutes, reality reasserted itself. I was probably hallucinating. Surely, some of the paint was lead-based, and who knew what prolific mold spores were nesting, upset by my movements. These were rational explanations, but the fear, although lessened, would not leave me entirely. I didn't feel like I could turn my back on the door, as crazy as that sounds. The door had to go, or I wouldn't be able to work without feeling paranoid. Inching closer to the door, I resolved not to look unless I had to. Wasn't sure my heart could take another scare without seizing in my chest. Bending down, I pushed the fear aside and focused on the sounds of the lock, which was hard to hear over the thrum of blood rushing in my ears. Turning the metal implements counterclockwise, then a sharp turn to the right, the mechanism shifted with an audible click, and the thick-set door exhaled as it pushed open just enough to grab the edge of the door. A stale and altogether unpleasant smell creeped out, making me wrinkle my nose in disgust. Pulling my mask back up, I adjusted my goggles to fit firmly over my eyes and pulled the door wide enough to fit through. What I saw left me speechless. Instead of a room like I had expected, or some cramped closet where a child was horribly imprisoned, it was a twilight forest, which explained the ambient light. From the doorway, I could see two moons. One was so small it could have been a star, except it seemed to orbit the larger one with a speed that suggested it made hundreds of revolutions within an hour. I was so starstruck, I took my goggles off, rubbed my eyes, thinking it would dispel the illusion, but the forest remained. Wanting to find the missing worker and get out, I came back into the room and dragged my heavy toolbox to wedge the door open, not wanting to accidentally get locked inside. Feeling confident the door would remain wedged, I put a hammer through my utility belt because honestly, I had no idea what lived here, and I wasn't too keen to find out the hard way, and grabbed my mag light flashlight to illuminate the dimly lit forest floor, a can of spray paint to mark my way back, a bottle of water, and an emergency flare. Before I could talk myself out of it, I strode through the door. I didn't want to use my flashlight unless I had to, so I gave my eyes a few minutes to adjust to the low-level light. Or maybe that was my excuse to stay close to the door. I had assumed the eye I saw was the worker's, but now I wasn't too sure. He did not ask for help, but he could have been afraid to make too much noise. I hated the conflicting thoughts running through my head. For every opposition, there was an equally rational explanation. As a compromise, I would only go so far in that I could still see the door and started walking straight ahead, closer to the towering trees. With my head on a constant swivel, my stomach in knots, I felt tension all over my body. When I was close enough to reach out and touch one of the branches, I saw these were no ordinary trees. They looked more like porcupine quills. Their tips glistened. Upon closer inspection, I noticed an unpleasant, acrid smell like ammonia or embalming fluid. It wasn't too hard to imagine these suckers were a nasty bit of business if you accidentally stuck yourself. I was tempted to take a sample, but didn't want to risk getting poked. Searching the ground, I found a small rock and backed away from the tree to a safe distance before throwing it. As soon as it made contact, the tree reacted in a blur of movement so fast, if I hadn't been staring at its center mass, I could have missed it. Those weren't trees. Trees don't have teeth. I was beginning to think this was a fool's errand. I hadn't seen no evidence to support that a worker was here, trapped or otherwise, and so I turned around and headed back towards the door. I was halfway there when I heard a scream, low and mournful, somewhere to my right. "Hello?" I cupped my hands around my mouth and yelled. I was within running distance to the door, so I threw caution to the wind. 1 second, then two passed, and no response. I was about to try one more time when a man screamed something in Spanish. "Where are you? Follow my voice!" I pitched my voice as loud as possible. I stared at the door, wishing I had never come here, let alone found someone who needed rescuing. Shit! 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 I wavered on the spot. If I went in the direction of the voice, I wouldn't be able to keep the door in my line of sight, and that worried me. So many things could happen, least of which I could damn us both if the door closed. As I made my decision, a rustling sound snapped my eyes to the right, and a man, grievously injured if his limp has anything to go by, hobbled out of the foliage in stained carpenter pants and a ripped t-shirt that might have been white once. Now it was stained in Rorschach splotches of blood. My feet moved of their own accord to intercept the poor man when we made eye contact, and he shook his head no, pressing his finger to his lips in the universal "be quiet" gesture. I think I was too scared to make a sound anyway, but then I found out why. It wasn't the force of the rock that disturbed the trees earlier. It was the sound of it whizzing by. The man opened his mouth wide and screamed, a dead man's last cry of anguish. The trees closest to him rattled violently. Then I heard a sound I couldn't place until one of the quills was sticking out of his chest. Blood frothed and bubbled down his chin as he landed heavily on his knees from the force of the blow. With his dying breath, he mouthed the words, "Run," then kneeled over. Survival instinct took over as my head was a static buzz of shock, and I sprinted to the door, practically threw the 100-pound toolbox out of my way in a Herculean feat of raw adrenaline, then slammed it shut. I should have let it be. I had already seen enough to feed my nightmares for years, but my rational mind just couldn't accept monster trees, even though I had just seen them with my own two eyes. So I looked through the keyhole. Damn it! I felt like I had to, and gasped at the new landscape I saw. I wasn't feeling bold enough to explore any more today, but despite the warning bells clanging in my head, I knew it was only a matter of time before my curiosity got the better of me. Regardless, Bob was going to have to bump my pay if he expected me to deal with shit like that. Well, I hope you enjoyed that story. And if you did, please like and subscribe. So, until next time, be good, be great, be spooky.